Yes, I'm going to present. So this paper is on the dominant currency financing channel of external adjustment, and it's joined with Camila Casas and Sergi Meleshchuk. Camila is also here to maybe answer questions in the chat. And since we are all at the IMF, of course, the usual disclaimer applies that the views are ours and not those of the IMF. So let me actually start with a very similar motivation as Shepnam, and say that, of course, traditionally we were taught that depreciation of the home currency leads to an increase in the trade balance because exports are increasing and imports are declining as a response. However, we also know from the papers by Shepnam and Mark and also many others that the depreciation of the domestic currency can have contractionary effects. And we know from the work by Gita and others that there's a large component of dominant currency pricing, so that many firms are actually having the exports and the imports priced in US dollars. So when that's the case, then the depreciation in the domestic currency doesn't necessarily lead to an expansion in the export quantities. However, what is happening is that the profits of these firms actually increase in response. And now the question that we pose here is, to what extent the borrowing in domestic in the same currency as the pricing of the exports and the imports has an effect on the depreciation of the exchange rate on the external position. And this is in the external position instead of the kind of local variables like investment and so on. And so here the crucial question is, what is the export? So if imports respond stronger than exports, then we would have a positive effect on the external adjustment. So it makes the country in terms of this the net investment position better off. So let's look at the example of Colombia, where we can actually see that there was a very sharp depreciation at the end of 2014 and the beginning of 2015. And this depreciation was induced by a drop in the oil price. And there are very few Colombian firms that, though, make a large part of the economy, and that's why the depreciation was so strong. But a lot of firms were actually not really affected or not driving the depreciation of the peso relative to the dollar. At the same time, you can also see that imports were dropping, as we would expect, but you can also see that exports were dropping a lot. And this is true for both oil exports, and is also the case for non-oil exports. And now the question is, does the foreign currency borrowing to some extent explain the drop in imports in addition to the traditional channel, and does it explain the drop in the exports? So what we do in the paper is we do an event study around this depreciation of the peso. And what we do is we use a novel identification strategy by exploiting the debt maturity structure of the firm's foreign currency debt. So we calculate for each firm how much the debt repayments increase due to the interaction between the currency movement and the foreign currency debt maturity structure. So we look at the firms that have debt in US dollars outstanding just before the depreciation. And then we look into when exactly they have to pay back this debt in foreign currency. And the more the foreign currency appreciates, the more the debt they have to pay back. And we think of that as a relatively exogenous variation in terms of the balance sheet to the depreciation. And since the depreciation was relatively unexpected, we think that this is a good treatment variable to study exactly like what the consequences of this change in the net worth of the firm is on exports and on imports. What we find is that actually this this increase in the debt repayments due to the depreciation and the borrowing in foreign currency does not have an effect on exports. However, what we do find is that it does have a very strong negative effect on imports, but this is only the case for firms that do not export. So only for the firms that are not exporting, we can actually see that the borrowing in foreign currency, when the currency depreciates, has a negative effect on imports. We also see then whether the interest rates of the firms that they have to pay changes after the depreciation when they have been exposed more strongly. And we find that only for non-exporters, again, that the interest rates that banks charge these firms are higher, and they are also more likely to be delinquent. And these results hold after controlling for bank times time fixed effects, since we have a credit register where we can control for that, and we match firms and banks. So our interpretation of that is that since in Colombia, trade is almost exclusively invoiced in US dollars, as has been shown by other papers, the exports serve as a hedge immediately when the currency depreciates, because the prices are sticky. So consistent with this kind of hedging argument that the firms have higher revenues, we also find that when firms use foreign currency derivatives, or when they have foreign assets holdings in US dollars, we also find that the effect of the depreciation when they have more foreign currency borrowing is completely muted. So now let me talk quickly about the data. We use first customs firm level data. We merge that with credit registry data. Then we use standard balance sheet data from Orbis. We have foreign assets data of the firms, and we use foreign exchange derivatives data. So it's quite a lot of different data sets that we are merging together. And overall, since all of these data sets are very comprehensive, we match over 90% of the imports and the exports. Then we construct 3 different measures of exposure. First, we use kind of the standard measure, which is just the foreign currency leverage. So we look at the loans in foreign currency that the firms have just before the depreciation, and we divide that by total assets. And then we use the liquidity, we construct this liquidity shock, which is the increase in the debt repayment due to the depreciation between 2014 Q1 and 2015 Q3. So during this depreciation. So what we're going to make use of is essentially that firms have to pay back their loans at different times, and depending on what the exchange rate is at this particular day, they have to pay back more or less debt. Some firms, though, you could say, are borrowing very short term, and then the reason for being extremely exposed is that they're actually bad firms and they just borrow short term. So that's why we start a little bit earlier. Actually, we use 2014 Q1, and the depreciation only starts in 2014 Q3. So actually the firms that are borrowing very, very short term are the ones that actually have like kind of a negative liquidity shock. So they benefit from the short appreciation of the peso that happens before. And since we think that, you know, when exactly they borrowed and when they have to pay back, when they have the same maturity, we think that's relatively exogenous. That's why we think that this is a good treatment variable. In addition to this liquidity shock, we also compute a wealth shock, which is the liquidity shock, which is the increase in debt repayment until kind of the strong depreciation ends, and then the increase in the debt that they have due to debt that matures much later. So we take the exchange rate at 2015 Q3, and then we multiply the remaining debt with this outstanding exchange rate. So that's kind of the net worth shock in addition to this liquidity shock that they have to serve immediately during the depreciation. So then what we do is a different strategy around this large sudden unanticipated depreciation of the Colombian peso. And the depreciation, as I said before, was driven by a drop in oil prices and not the result of a macro crisis. So many firms were actually not directly affected. And it was really just because of like 1 or 2 very, very big firms in Colombia that are quite heavily exposed to oil. So we think that this is an ideal laboratory to study the dominant currency financing channel. So what we do is we use our difference in difference strategy around this depreciation, and we regress firm level exports and imports first, and we regress that on the interaction between the foreign currency exposure, which is one of the three measures that I mentioned before, and then we interact that with the post dummy that is one after the depreciation. And then we start with the effects on exports. We do not find that there's a strong significant effect of more foreign currency borrowing before the depreciation on exports. The coefficient is negative, but it's statistically insignificant. And you can see that when you look at this graph, when we essentially replace the post dummy with dummies for each date, and we see that when the depreciation happens, the effect of foreign currency borrowing on exports is the same as before and doesn't really change over time. Now let's look at imports. What we see for imports is there is the very strong effect for the average firm in the sample, as you can see in column 1, 4, and 7, depending on the different measures. So the standard foreign currency leverage measure, the liquidity shock measure, or the wealth shock measure, and a very strong effect of the firms that are not exporting, which are the firms in column 2, 5, and 8. And you can see when you compare the liquidity shock and the wealth shock, you can see that most of it is actually driven by the liquidity shock and not so much is driven by the wealth shock. So for example, if you compare column 4 and 7, you see that a lot of it is driven by the liquidity shock, but not so much is driven by kind of this remaining debt that has to be paid back much later. So firms do not seem to adjust immediately, even if they know that they actually have to pay back more debt later on. But still the coefficient is a bit larger. Then when we actually look at the firms that are exporting, we do not find an effect. So you see that the coefficient is negative, but it's not statistically significant. So somehow these firms that are exporting seem to be immune to the increase in debt that they have to pay back. So a decrease in the network. And let me show you how it looks like when we plot that coefficient over time. We can see here exactly at the time when the currency depreciates, you see that firms that are not exporting decrease their imports quite significantly. When you look at firms that are exporting, you do not see that effect. So we interpret that as that firms are, when they are exporting, are hedged especially when exports are invoiced in US dollars, because it's not the case that for foreigners it gets cheaper to import from that country. It is the case that firms benefit from that because they have higher revenues automatically in Colombian pesos in our case. So that to some extent offsets this kind of higher debt servicing cost. There are also other forms of being hedged against the depreciation or against this increase in the liabilities in pesos, and that is either you have US dollar assets, which is actually not possible in Colombia to have these US dollar assets in the country, so they have actually foreign assets in US dollars, or they have a foreign exchange derivative contract. And here you can see that a lot of the firms actually do not use that, especially if you look at the non-exporting firms. You see only 4% of the firms have foreign assets, 1.6% of the firms have FX derivatives, and in total only 5.1% of the firms hedge in either of the two ways. When you go to exporting firms, the shares are increasing quite significantly. So now let's see whether it's also the case that through FX derivative usage or through foreign asset holdings, it's the case that firms are hedged and they do not decrease their imports in response to the depreciation when they had more foreign currency borrowing just before. So you can see here that the double interaction reflects the effect of firms that do not hedge. And this is hedging either through derivatives or through foreign assets, but the result holds exactly the same way if you use either of the two. So you see that the effect now is actually stronger than before, is what we would expect. And when you look at the triple interaction, you can see that this is additional effect of the firms that are hedging. And you can see that the coefficients in absolute values are very, very similar to each other, which suggests that once you are using FX derivatives or you have foreign assets, you do not have to contract your imports as the firms that do not use that hedge. I think the most interesting here is actually when we look at the firms that are exporting, so the firms that are in column 3, 6, and 9, what you can see is you could say that, well, actually maybe exporting is just very strongly correlated with FX derivative usage or with foreign asset holdings, but we can actually here look at the firms that do neither use FX derivatives nor have FX assets. So in these firms are actually in the double interaction in 3, 6, and 9. And you see that even these firms that export but do not have foreign assets and do not use FX derivative markets, you cannot see that they reduce their imports significantly. So being an exporter is actually sufficient in order to be hedged against this like contraction in imports. Now what we do is we ask the questions like what is the economic significance of that, and we make a partial equilibrium calculation and construct a counterfactual how much imports or the trade balance would be if there would be no foreign currency borrowing. And let me say, actually, Colombia is a country where there's a substantial amount of foreign currency borrowing, but it's not as large as in other countries. So, and you can see, despite that, there's actually quite a large effect. So you see that the peak to throw import contraction is estimated to have been 17% smaller if there wouldn't have been any foreign currency borrowing, and as you can see here in the red dotted line.
1 minute.
So let me conclude. What we do in this paper is we study the trade consequences of dominant currency financing, so financing in the same currency as your exports and imports are priced. And what we see is that this dominant currency financing leads to a debt revaluation due to the depreciation. However, it is the case that firms that export, they're naturally hedged against that. Also, that's the case for firms that use FX derivatives or firms that have foreign assets. And we use a novel identification strategy by exploring the debt maturity structure. And we find that the imports of non-exporters are declining, while the imports for exporters are staying the same, and exports are also the same. That means that borrowing in foreign currency or in the same currency as the trade is priced leads actually to an increase in the trade balance. But of course, we have to be careful when we observe that in interpreting that as a positive effect. This increase in the trade balance is driven by financial frictions that potentially induce a contractionary depreciation and therefore for imports. And also what that implies is that a lot of firms, since they are hedged using the FX derivatives or foreign assets, it's important to develop these markets more so that firms can actually, if they want to, be hedged against these developments. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Laura Alfaro is our